Hey everyone, you are listening to Retail Shift, a field guide to retail success. This podcast is produced by Merchant Method, and I'm Chris Gio. I'm a retailer, I'm a merchant, and I'm also a small business owner and consultant. This podcast season, I'm sharing my qualitative notes about the retail industry. They're straightforward, and I'm sharing them simply. What I hope you do is pair these observations with our retail trend report so that you can unlock more retail profit with ease. A few weeks ago, I was part of an online conversation about employee perks. So specifically, it was a conversation happening among small business owners, and the conversation was around the capacity for most small businesses to provide employee perks compared to large retail counterparts. Counterparts that have both the capital and the capacity, the bandwidth to provide full medical and dental and vision benefits, paid time off, and then additional perks like employee discounts, things of that nature. And for me, having held numerous jobs at a variety of companies, some large, some very, very entrepreneurial startup, some small, and also having interviewed at other companies for roles that I decided not to pursue, I have definitely been on the quote unquote selling side of the interview process, selling myself as a highly qualified competitive candidate. And I can tell you from my experience, not only as someone who has interviewed for numerous roles, but also someone who has filled and hired for numerous roles, that candidates want the same things as customers. And what they want is to feel confident in the choice that they're making. Candidates and customers want the same thing. They want to feel confident in the choice that they're making. And not only in accepting the job offer and not only in having their salary needs met, but also in spending time during the interview. Because when they are spending time interviewing with you, it means time taken away from researching or applying for or interviewing for other roles. And we know that time is valuable. Time is money. And this whole conversation around employee perks had me thinking about what I consider to be an often overlooked part of the interview process. And this overlooked part is our retail shift for the week. And I am here to tell you that you need to sell the job. Your job as a hiring manager is to sell the job as early as appropriate. You can start talking about the company, start talking about the culture as early as appropriate. You can talk about things that not only are easy to quantify, like salary range, general amount of time, that paid amount of time an employee might get, the monetary scope of their responsibilities. So if you have an employee that might have buying responsibilities, what is that responsibility equate to from a revenue perspective? But you also should be selling the role in ways that are more difficult to qualify, like culture. We can talk about culture all day, but displaying company culture and brand culture is a different thing than talking about it and paying lip service to it. It's difficult to qualify camaraderie among the team members. It's challenging to qualify employee satisfaction, professional fulfillment. There's a misconception that the number one priority, and that there can only be a number one priority, is that the primary role for candidates during an interview is to sell themselves. And that there's also this misconception that interviewers are primarily checking for fit. The fitness, the relative compatibility between a candidate's past performance and ability to to fulfill a role that you're hiring, as well as future potential to grow within a role and grow within the company. But remember that you are interviewing sellers right? So whether you're interviewing someone who will work for you seasonally in a part-time capacity, a very temporary capacity, or you are hiring the head of merchandising, a high functioning retail employee, within that range, everyone is a seller. They could be describing product benefits to a customer in your store, or they could be making a very persuasive case on spending tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars on inventory based on analytics and forecasting. In both of those scenarios and in scenarios in between, these are retailers selling. And so remember that you need to sell to a seller. In my first retail position, I worked in corporate retail recruiting, and I had a variety of responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities was to create a narrative for candidates around what it's like to be an employee of the company. So these were roles in inventory, analytics, inventory strategy, merchandise financial planning. At that point, that was considered an entry-level role. But it's by no means entry level, but it was the most entry level role that we were recruiting for. And at that time, we would bring in 20 candidates a week, similar to a group interview style, though every candidate interviewed on their own individually with either one or two hiring managers, and they rotated. So they had a total of at least 3 interviews in their morning with us. It was a 30-minute interview followed by a break, another 30, a break, another 30, a break, or off cycle from that. And that was generally the format. We conducted these interviews weekly for about 90 to 95% of the year. We had a huge need, but there was also a lot of great candidates. It would have been easy for us to not go this distance of really selling the job, but the reason we did it is because we knew the candidates were interviewing for multiple roles. We knew that candidates were not only going to say yes based on a brand reputation, but also based on their ability to be highly satisfied both professionally and personally within a role, within a brand, within a corporate company, and with a culture. So I often did things like model the way and model the expectation. Right. So I was hosting a lot. I was making introductions between candidates, right? Because you're in a room with 20 other people, other candidates interviewing for similar roles, making introductions between candidates and hiring managers, and keeping the train running on schedule. Modeling that illustrated this narrative around ease of introduction, friendliness, professional communication, and structure. It shows a candidate a lot when you are conducting interviews in that way. I've been in far too many casual interviews where either the interviews are running way too long, or interviews before my own interview were running too long, and so I was waiting and waiting and waiting. I've had interviews be far too casual or unstructured. Interviewers not realizing that they were going to be speaking with me, and that paints a really, really strong impression in the negative. I showed high-level customer care by scheduling group lunches and then securing guests in roles similar to what the candidates were interviewing for. And they answered questions. It was really casual. It was not part of the interview process. But what we're showing is, what is it like to be new in the role? What does the lunchroom look like? Because sometimes candidates need to visualize themselves in the role. I presented company benefits and answered a lot of questions about those benefits. And if I didn't know the answer, I also displayed follow through in researching and then completing the full circle of that conversation. I was fortunate that I was able to provide swag by way of mugs and pencils and notepads and things like that. And the takeaway in this conversation is not what can you give your candidates. The takeaway really is, how can you sell the job and leave candidates with a strong, favorable impression, a feeling about what it might really be like to work for you, what it might really be like to work for the brand, how you might really get treated as an employee of the company. And each of these things I was able to do really indicate thoughtfulness, structure, something that can also be conveyed in an entrepreneurial environment. Just because an environment is a startup does not mean everything needs to be a fire drill. It doesn't have to mean that. I immediately modeled expectations for internal and external customer service, right? Modeling cross-functional relationships, working across brands. In the case of benefits, as I mentioned before, I showcased a base knowledge, thoughtfully sourced and trained a base knowledge or follow through if I needed to get back to a candidate. And again, the swag was a reminder and an extra perk, but sometimes an insider tip or a hot tip was valued even more than the mug or the pencil. So during these group interviews, not only was there, again, a great need for candidates, we didn't need to do all of it, but we did it, again, because it was on brand. We did it to sell the brand. We did our part to sell the job. And so I want to ask you, as you're thinking about your hiring goals for the holiday season or even for fall, as you start to build up to your true hiring need for the holiday season, how can you sell the job that you're filling during your next round of interviews? And you can do that by reflecting on recent new hires and reflecting on the outlier experiences. So either superstar candidates that really came in, hit the ground running, or on the other end, candidates who felt like it was just a really poor fit from the start that couldn't get their legs under them. Ask yourself, what did those candidates know, or what didn't they know about your brand during their onboarding experience? What expectations do you have for customer service, and how can you model that during the recruiting and interview process? How do you want your customers to feel in your space? Based on that, how do you want your candidates to feel in your interviewing space? And it's these types of questions that should and will up your interviewing game. And at the end of the day, not only do you decide which candidate you want to extend the job offer to, but candidates also decide what job they want to take. So sell that job. Thank you so much for listening this week. Here's how to make sure you follow along for all of our retail insights. Subscribe to Retail Shift on iTunes by searching Merchant Method, or, subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if there is a nugget that really sticks with you or rings true for you, or a piece of advice you found valuable, leave a review or write a comment. And if you've got a like-minded merchant friend like you or like me, feel free to share the podcast. Thank you so much. This is Chris Gia with Merchant Method, and I look forward to connecting with you next week. Sell that job.